Well, a very good morning or good afternoon from wherever you're joining us from around the world. A warm welcome to our delegates and speakers who are key tripartite leaders of the world of work. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sharanjit Lail, and I'm delighted to be moderating this important session during the 109th International Labour Conference Week. Now, 2 years ago, the International Labour Conference adopted the Violence and Harassment Convention number 190 and its accompanying recommendation number 206. Now, a year later, the world of work has been hit globally by the COVID-19 crisis. Millions of people have stopped working to prevent the spread of the virus and lost their jobs and incomes. Many others have shifted overnight to teleworking, while others have continued to provide essential services, often putting their own safety and lives at risk. This has changed the way many people work, but it has also added stress on workers and employers, including those engaged in businesses considered essential. Now, economic and social stresses brought about by the pandemic, as well as confinement measures, have heightened tensions and intensified the risk of violence and harassment against frontline workers. Also, an increase in the occurrences of domestic violence have been reported all over the world, with negative repercussions on the world of work. Convention number 190 and recommendation number 206 have shown their relevance to the current dramatic circumstances more than ever. Now, on the occasion of the entry into force of Convention 190, today's virtual event is really an opportunity for a renewed commitment to prevent, address, and end violence and harassment in the world of work for all. We want to also reflect on its relevance in the context of COVID-19 and promote its ratification. It's also an opportunity to hear about challenges and lessons learned from countries that have already embarked on the process, and to learn how parliamentarians who are key to both ratification and implementation can be pivotal in progressing a world of work free from violence and harassment by engaging in the wider community as well as social partners. Now, interpretation is available in English, French, and Spanish, and you can select the language you prefer by pressing on the bottom with the globe icon. Please, of course, remember to mute the original audio. And for matters of accessibility, interpretation in international sign language and live captioning in English is also provided. For technical audio reasons, all participants' microphones and video will be muted. The audience, of course, is welcome to share their thoughts and submit any questions at all in the chat box during the event. I will be calling on to some of these questions at the end of the session. Now, for panelists, please activate your video when you are taking the floor and when I introduce you momentarily, but do remember to deactivate when you are not speaking. Now, this event is also being live streamed on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So please use the hashtag #RatifyC190. And now to our speakers, if you can all turn your videos on, I'd like to introduce you now. We have Mr. Guy Ryder, the Director General of the International Labour Organization. Ms. Giselle Renampi, the Minister of Labour, Employment, Public Services and Social Laws from Madagascar, who will be giving us a video message. We have Mr. Claudio Moroni, the Minister of Labour, Employment and Social Security from Argentina. Ms. Marie Clark Walker, the Secretary Treasurer of the Canadian Labour Congress. Mr. Roberto Suarez Santos, the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers. Ms. Helena Dali, the Commissioner for Equality, European Commission. Ms. Susan Kihika, the Senator in the Kenyan Parliament and member of the Bureau of Women Parliamentarians of the Inter-Parliamentarian Union. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, before I open the floor to the discussion, I would like to introduce that this event marks the opening of the ILO Action Week on Convention number 190, which of course starts today and will culminate this Friday, the 25th, with the entering into force of Convention 190. Now, on Friday, the ILO will also launch a global multimedia campaign to promote the ratification and implementation of Convention number 190 and its accompanying recommendation number 206. The campaign will put at the disposal of governments, workers, and employers, as well as all interested people around the world, a toolkit of multimedia resources in multiple languages, as well as a legal guide to promote the ratification and implementation of ILO standards. Now, to give you a flavor of the ILO global campaign, let's watch this video.
No worker, persons with employer's duties, woman, man, trainee, job seeker, migrant. No one should have to choose between their right to work and their physical, mental and sexual integrity and dignity. The ILO Convention C190 aims to stop violence and harassment at work, a binding commitment, by all, for all. A commitment that requires governments, employers and workers and their organizations to work together for equal rights and opportunities and a world of work based on dignity and respect. C190 gives people across industries and countries the chance to get their rights respected through prevention and protection, enforcement and remedies, guidance and training. An inclusive, integrated and gender-responsive approach to shape a future of work free from violence and harassment for all. We no longer accept any form of violence and harassment in the world of work. Let's turn this vision into a reality and make work safe for everyone, everywhere. Get involved. Call on your government to ratify and implement C190. For more, visit ilo.org/C190.
Well, what a great introduction that was. And now, as you heard in that video, from this Friday, of course, all the ILO campaign resources will be available on www.ilo.org/C90. Now, download them and discover the new ILO legal guide. And you can spread the word about C190. Use the hashtag ratify C190, and let's take action to free the world of work from violence and harassment. And now to our esteemed panelists, we would like to set the scene on why the ratification and implementation of C190 and R206 on eliminating violence and harassment from the world of work is so important. What are the challenges, especially in light of the pandemic? Now, we will dedicate the next half an hour to a panel discussion amongst our speakers. This is the first part of our discussion, of course. And of course, remember, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to submit them in the chat box, and I will refer to them at the end of the session. Now, we will start with our first question directed to you, Director General, Mr. Ryder. Now, 2 years ago, of course, when C190 was adopted, it marked really a historic milestone for the future of work at the ILO centenary. Now, as mentioned, this Friday, the 25th of June, C190 enters into force. Meanwhile, we know a global pandemic has hit and disrupted the world, and it's deepened inequalities, and in many instances, it's fueled a spike in violence and harassment as well, including at work. Now, in your view, how can these ILO standards help build a world of work based on dignity and respect for all, as of course we still struggle with the health and economic and social impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the question. Well, I think I want to start by saying that when Convention 190 was adopted 2 years ago, and of course, that was in a period before we knew anything about the pandemic, I think the world of work was making a very fundamental point, and that was that we simply do not accept any form of violence and harassment in the world of work, and it was incumbent upon all member states of the ILO across the world, governments, employers and workers, to work together to make sure that the right of anybody in the world of work to be able to work free of any violence and harassment was realized. And really, this is what Convention 190 is all about. And if you think about it, it's a pretty basic proposition that we should be able to work in these conditions of dignity and decency. And without going into the details of the convention, you will see, if you examine it, that it calls upon governments that ratify to put in place policies which are pretty far-reaching. That is to say, to prevent, to remedy, to provide sanctions for any act of violence and harassment at work. But of course, since 190 was adopted, we've had this cataclysmic crisis in the world of work. And I think it is worth reflecting as we move into our week of action, what this pandemic has meant for the world of work and Convention 190 in particular. Well, I think we're all aware that the crisis has had a devastating impact on people at work. It's destroyed many millions of jobs. It's taken trillions of dollars off the global wage bill. It's thrust many people into poverty. And, there are two things I think we can draw from this situation, which are of particular relevance to to Convention 190. One is that we've changed the way we work. We're working in different ways right now. How much of this is just due to pandemic conditions? How much will be permanent? I think we'll see in the coming months. And secondly, the pandemic has really shown up and increased levels of vulnerability at work. And the bad news is, I fear, that this vulnerability has led to increases in acts of violence and harassment. The fact that there's a great deal of remote work taking place means that harassment in cyberspace is becoming an ever-increasing part of working experience. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence to that effect. And if you put all of this together, the interest in building a better future of work, the adoption of Convention 190, and now the disruption of the pandemic, I think you'll see that many things are coming together, which all taken together underline the urgency of putting the, I think, wonderful provisions of 190 into practice. We've made a good start. We have 6 countries which have already ratified the convention, but we need, of course, to take this up in a very big way to scale so that we can get closer and closer to this notion of a world of work without violence and harassment. And a key point I want to say is, yes, governments will have responsibility and leadership in this regard, but they need to work closely with business and with trade unions, all of whom were part of putting Convention 190 together. So it's one of the many challenges, and not the least of the challenges which the pandemic has put right in front of us and right now. So this week of action, I think, is of enormous importance.
Well, thank you for that, DG Ryder. As you mentioned, there is such an urgency at this time because I guess it's been exacerbated to a great degree by the pandemic. Now, the next question is directed to you, Commissioner Helena Dalli. Now, as you heard, Mr. Ryder there, of course, ensuring equal treatment opportunities for all workers, not just for women. Of course, there's lots of discrimination and stigma out there. This is really key in preventing and eliminating violence and harassment at work. We know the European Union has been a front runner in this, and even more so in the current COVID-19 pandemic. So tell us, what are the key pillars, policy elements, and initiatives that the European Union has developed to address the pervasiveness of violence and harassment in the world of work?
Good morning, and thank you for this question. The EU's gender equality strategy sets out an ambitious agenda to achieve a gender equal Europe where women and men, girls and boys in all their diversity are free to pursue their chosen paths in life and have equal opportunities to thrive and lead in our European societies. So addressing gender-based violence against women, including harassment in the workplace, is one of our key actions. So while the ratification of the Istanbul Convention remains a priority, we are also working on a legislative proposal to prevent and combat all forms of gender-based violence, including gender-based harassment in the world of work. This proposal should be adopted before the end of the year. And in our gender equality strategy, we also announced several non-legislative initiatives. For instance, next year, we will launch a new EU network on gender-based violence that will bring together national experts to exchange good practices on the prevention of gender-based violence, the training of professionals, and capacity building. There are several existing pieces of legislation known as equality directives, which oblige EU member states to prohibit gender-based violence and sexual harassment in employment, occupation, self-employment, and in the provision of goods and services. So they also require member states to provide effective remedies to victims and to prevent re-victimization. So this existing legal framework can be further strengthened. And that's why we want the ILO Convention number 190 to apply in the EU. The Commission has made a proposal to the Council to enable member states to ratify the convention.
Well, thank you for that. Another question to you, Commissioner. We know that C190 calls for an inclusive, integrated, gender-responsive approach, which encompasses measures on prevention and protection, enforcement and remedies, as well as guidance, training and awareness raising. Based on the EU experience, what are good and promising practices to bring about change and eradicate violence and harassment at work?
Okay, we are currently evaluating our approach in preparation of a legislative proposal on gender-based violence against women and domestic violence, which we will present, as I said, by the end of this year. And we are looking at the existing EU instruments in this area, whether there are any gaps, and gathering evidence on the impact of different policy options. Earlier this year, we launched a public consultation and received around 700 contributions. And in addition to having the legal framework in place, grassroots projects are important. And this is why we dedicate funding for projects tackling gender-based violence and harassment, including in the workplace. For instance, SEAS, which we co-funded, developed training programs for HR professionals and managers. We also funded the Project CARVE, which produced a guide for companies to respond to violence against women. And we funded the European Trade Union Confederation's project, Safe at Home, Safe at Work. Awareness raising is also crucial, as the convention underlines, and we have a lot of experience here. The No, No, 9 campaign, for instance, is a good example of a recent EU-wide campaign that reached a wider audience. Thank you.
Commissioner Dalli, thank you so much for that, and really great to hear some of the programs that the Commissioner and the EU is embarking on. Now, the next question is directed at Minister Moroni. Of course, we are absolutely delighted that Argentina is among the front runners of the ratification of C190. And we'd really like to hear the experience of Argentina in the ratification process during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, Mr. Moroni, we particularly want you and thank you for being here at such an early hour in Argentina and on a national holiday. And this really attests to the commitment of the Argentinian government to C190. So could you tell us what moved your country to engage in this process? And could you also share with other countries that are considering ratifying C190 some of the opportunities, challenges, and the lessons learned in Argentina?
Buenos días, les agradezco la posibilidad de participar en esta charla. Como Estado miembro de la OIT y centralmente desde el gobierno del presidente Alberto Fernández, nos sentimos muy gratificados de haber participado, ser uno de los primeros países del mundo en ratificar el convenio 190. Estamos frente a las primeras normas internacionales que tratan sobre violencia y acoso en el mundo del trabajo, que reconocen el derecho de toda persona a un lugar de trabajo libre de violencia y acoso. La lucha contra toda forma de desigualdad y la ampliación de derechos siempre formó y formará parte de la agenda de nuestro gobierno. Y en ese sentido, este convenio tiene todos los requisitos para ser convertido por nosotros en una política pública concreta. Siempre los gobiernos populares, en conjunto con los actores y actoras del mundo del trabajo, hemos priorizado aquellas medidas nacionales e internacionales que se dirijan a consolidar los derechos necesarios para la construcción de trabajo decente, sin violencia laboral. La génesis de la ratificación por parte de nuestro país la podemos encontrar en el primer discurso del presidente Fernández cuando inaugura el periodo de sesiones ordinarias el 1 de marzo del 2020. Allí se presentaron las principales medidas a tomar por el Poder Ejecutivo. Estuvo presente en ese caso el compromiso de ratificar el convenio 190, cosa que se cumplió en ese mismo periodo pese a estar en el peor momento de la pandemia. Pero la ratificación del 190 es una consecuencia de una práctica que ya venía en Argentina desde el año 2005, 2006. En esos años se creó la Comisión Tripartite de Igualdad de Oportunidades. En enero de 2007 se crea la Oficina de Asesoramiento sobre Violencia Laboral en este ministerio, la que tiene funciones de prevención, de asesoramiento y tratamiento de denuncias, de articulación institucional y de investigación. A partir del desempeño de nuestra oficina, se desarrollan diferentes redes con actores sociales. La Red Intersindical Nacional contra la Violencia Laboral participan más de 110 sindicatos, además de integrantes de las 3 centrales de trabajadores, la CGT, la CTA de los trabajadores y la CTA Autónoma. Tenemos también una red de empleadores por ambientes de trabajo libres de violencia, que firmaron un acta de compromiso en el año 2012. Con ellos se han producido manuales, guías. Por otra parte, trabajamos en red federal con las provincias, en el ámbito del Consejo Federal de Ministros de Trabajo, donde a partir del acta de compromiso de 2014 se planteó constituir ámbitos provinciales de abordaje similares a la Oficina de Atención contra la Violencia Laboral. Estamos poniendo en marcha una red territorial de abordaje de la violencia laboral que integran 2 áreas de este ministerio. Estamos trabajando básicamente con los actores y las actoras del mundo laboral. Creo que por esta larga práctica de Argentina es que fuimos invitados a participar en las redacciones del 190 y hemos ratificado nuestro compromiso al ratificar este convenio cuya vigencia creemos que es muy importante para lograr el objetivo de todos, que es tener lugares de trabajo decentes.
Thank you very much, Minister Moroni. That was really wonderful to hear Argentina's experience and some of the challenges you've been facing as well. It is absolutely educational for other countries going through a similar process. Now, let's get the point of view of employers. And this next question is for Mr. Suarez Santos. We know the IOE has been strongly engaged in C190 and in promoting work environments that are free from violence and harassment. So could you share with us why taking such measures to prevent violence and harassment is so important for businesses, including in times of crisis like this current one? What are some of the challenges for employers, especially in small and medium-sized enterprises, and how can they be overcome?
Well, thank you very much, Sharonji. A pleasure to be here with you. Let me start also referring to the word unacceptable. I think Guy referred to that and other participants, the Minister of Argentina. These unacceptable behaviors is becoming more and more evident during the pandemic because of the pandemic. I mean, the devastating effects of the pandemic in terms of job losses are not minor, but when you see the consequence on health and safety, this is also something quite remarkable. And we keep saying, and we will be repeating that if you think that health and safety is going to remain at the workplace, it's going to remain at the same level as it was before, you are wrong. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the consequences of this pandemic for the future is that health and safety at work will be much more important, much more valuable than ever. So there is an ethical issue here from the employer side and as IOE and our member federations to fight strongly against violence and harassment at work. But it's also a productivity issue, which has to do also with the new challenges that we have before us, including the mental health challenges that are now more and more evident after the pandemic. And of course, when you look at that and you look from a business organization, what you can do, you have enormous challenges because violence and harassment at work, even though totally unacceptable, they are complex phenomena. And they need to be taken, of course, as a moral issue, but also as a matter of security, stability, public health, human dignity, but it has to be done in a kind of cooperation, partnership also with other organizations and public institutions. What are the main challenges that business face? And you referred in your question to small and medium companies. I mean, the first challenge is to build trust with their employees. At the end of the day, you will never get there to eradicate violence, to prevent violence, and also harassment if you don't have confidential channels with your employees whenever a situation like that happens. So that's one of the points, that's one of the elements that we are advocating in favor of creating these confidential channels, which has to do with building trust. Of course, there is an issue related to awareness, which I would say is the second, or even the first one. I mean, everyone at the workplace, the employers, workers, have to be aware that harassment and violence is unacceptable. And even if it seems evident, it's not so evident in many areas of the world. So there is a awareness aspect which needs to be not just endorsed, but also implemented by the company and also by the employees. And it means also a corporate mindset, a company mindset. And the third challenge, which I would like to stress, is also certainty. I mean, and this certainty is very important for especially small and medium companies. What is expected to be done? What is expected not to be accepted? And in order to have that clear, we need guidance. We need proper guidance from us, from employers and business organizations, from the ILO, from all different organizations. So we need to build, based also on what the convention, what the recommendation provide us, on guidance that is clear, accessible, and also concrete enough. So these three areas of action, building trust, campaign awareness, so that everybody's on the same page on the unacceptable nature of violence and harassment, and also the guidance that is needed, which is very concrete in many instances, are the three challenges, but the three areas in which we are working strongly, because we believe on that, and because also we believe it's also good for productivity and for the future. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Suarez Santos. And you're absolutely right. Everyone needs to be on the same page. So my next question will be to Marie Clark Walker. We know that the International Trade Union Confederation has also been really central in the adoption of C190, and trade unions around the world have played a key fundamental role in raising awareness about the impact of violence and harassment at work. Could you share with us why, of course, we know it's important, but why is it so important to tackle this problem of violence and harassment at work for workers all around the world, particularly in this current crisis? What are the challenges that you're seeing for workers, especially those in really vulnerable situations or working in sectors more exposed to violence and harassment? How can these be overcome?
Thank you, Sharonjeet, and thanks to everyone for joining us. It's very early in the morning here. Thank you, and hello to the rest of the panelists. So we know that millions of workers globally are affected by violence and harassment in the world of work. We heard the stories, we see the statistics across different sectors, and the evidence is very clear, particularly in the way in which it disproportionately affects women, racialized, indigenous, migrant, LGBTQI+ workers, workers with disabilities, and others who experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and inequality. Within the union movement, led mostly by women, trade unions have engaged in a multi-year campaign, a global multi-year campaign, with lobbying efforts leading up to the adoption of Convention 190 and Recommendation 206. Workers around the world also shared their stories, their experiences of violence and harassment, as well as examples of the promising practices in collective bargaining, and also in workplace action and policies that were put in place to prevent, respond to, and address violence and harassment. The stories definitely helped us to negotiate a very strong, what we believe anyways, a very strong and inclusive and comprehensive convention and recommendation. And we know that trade unions globally are committed to ending the issue of gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. And we will be keeping up the pressure and have been keeping up the pressure because we want to make sure that this convention is ratified widely and implemented. As was said by my colleague, during the COVID pandemic, the relevance of these instruments became even more apparent as we saw an increase, actually a disgusting, what we call a horrific increase in the issues of domestic violence right across the world, as well as a surge in gender-based violence and harassment incidents, particularly around and amongst frontline workers. There was also a rise in cyberbullying because more people were teleworking because millions had left. Offices were closed, businesses were closed, so people were at home on the phones, and that left them exposed to technology-enabled harassment. We also saw issues around the informal economy where workers were also experiencing dramatic increases in violence and harassment. We saw that in physical force that was being used against them whenever there were measures put in to restrict movement. Whenever those measures came into place, it became much more serious, much more violent for workers in the informal sector. An example, in Australia, the Nurses and Midwives Association issued a plea to their local communities, and I'm going to quote this because it's significant. Open quotes, "Please respect all nurses, midwives, and other health workers as they go about their important work, and also when they're traveling to and from work. Please do not treat nurses, midwives, and other health workers like they are infectious. These trained professionals should be respected and must not be abused, spat on, or assaulted as they move through our communities to and from their workplaces." Now, for a country to have to put something like that out, that will tell you that the situation was absolutely disgusting. None of us would have wanted to be in that situation. So in Canada, there was a little different experience. Unions responded very widely to the increase of domestic violence, as well as increased violence and harassment that was also experienced by frontline workers. And we saw the workers that we saw experience this the most: healthcare workers again, social service workers, domestic workers, those working in food and retail and cleaning. We also saw a rise in Canada, which again talks to the intersectionality of anti-Asian hatred and other forms of discriminatory harassment, particularly directed at women, who were clearly demonstrating the need for approaches to apply an intersectional lens. We heard stories from domestic workers, migrant workers, and these were just a few of the many, many distressing stories of violence and harassment that we heard both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And it's clear that the need to ratify and implement C190 and its recommendation is urgent. There is no doubt that all of these instruments can help us confine these stories to history and improve the world of work for all of us. Unions around the world have been organizing, campaigning just for that, from negotiating occupational health and safety workplace policies that address violence and harassment to representing workers who have experienced violence and harassment, including domestic violence. We've done some work on raising public awareness, especially gender-based violence and harassment, through national television and radio programs and social media, as in the case of Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Kenya. So we have been raising awareness and linking, showing the links between discrimination, inequality, and violence and harassment. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the Black Lives Matter movement, and that certainly has brought the issue of racial justice to the forefront of all of our public consciousness. So if we are to eradicate violence and harassment, we need to eradicate discrimination and inequality. C190 and recommendation 206 can help us do both.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that really crucial insights there, and those really worrying examples of violence and harassment. I mean, we've been talking about it, but you've actually voiced some of these terrible examples of what's been happening around the world, particularly during the pandemic. Now, the next question is to Senator Susan Kihika, And of course, you are here today representing the Interparliamentary Union, which really is a global organization of national parliaments that aims to empower parliaments and parliamentarians to promote peace and democracy and, of course, sustainable development. Parliamentarians are really instrumental, we know, in shaping a world free of violence and harassment, including at work. They promote legislative change, including ratification of ILO conventions through dialogue and coordinating with relevant stakeholders, as well as monitor the implementation of that legislation. Now, they've got a really important role in shaping public opinion and determining national budget allocations. So, Senator Kihika, in your capacity of IPU member, what can parliaments do to advocate for a world free of violence and harassment? What's the role in promoting the ratification of C190?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, by the way, for inviting me to take part in today's panel. And also let me say a big hello to all the other panelists on here. So we are also happy as IPU, but as well as parliaments actually around the world to be part of this very momentous occasion of the entry into force of the ILO Convention number 190 on violence and harassment. So this has been much awaited, and IPU has strongly supported this. So we are really glad to be part of this. Now, when I bring my perspective here from the global parliamentary community, as a global organization of parliaments, the IPU is currently working with members to make parliaments respectful, gender sensitive, and inclusive workplaces free from harassment and violence. So this really involves generating broad political will to, one, acknowledge the widespread violence that women face in politics, and two, to strengthen the capacity of parliaments to implement strong legal frameworks and policies to address all forms of violence and harassment. So this is why we must launch a strong call for action around the ratification of Convention number 190 and effective implementation. So first, we would like to seize this opportunity for parliaments to be fully recognized as workplaces of their own. As workplaces, parliaments need to do more and do better to change the culture of silence and impunity around harassment and violence in their own settings. And second, we call on you to recognize parliaments as key stakeholders in the implementation of the convention through their legislation, oversight, and budgetary and representative or representation functions. So as Convention number 190 enters into force, so let us make greater use of parliaments, contribution to achieve a better future of work, and let us engage them in the process. So as parliamentarians, we have a central role in the process of ratification of this convention, number 190. And just as our parliamentary functions are our engagement and determination in exercising our powers to impact the action of our governments, we need to ensure that national laws, policies, programs, and budgets adequately reflect the principles and obligations set out in Convention number 190. It is true that legislative initiative tends to rest with the executive branch.
Thank you, Senator Kihika. I think we seem to have lost you at the moment. Is that correct? Yes, unfortunately, we seem to have lost Senator Kihika there. She was speaking, but let's go to the next section of our discussion now. We're going to be looking in the next half an hour at good practices and what works in freeing the world of work from violence and harassment during the pandemics particularly, and also the contribution of countries and organizations in this. So let's go back to the experience of Argentina and to Minister Moroni now. We know that ratification is just the beginning of the journey. So could you tell us what steps your government and your ministry in particular have taken to deliver on these commitments? And what is the plan ahead to make C190 a reality for all in Argentina?
Bueno, como toda norma y más un tratado internacional requiere un doble tipo de aproximaciones. Por un lado, el tema de las leyes internas, las leyes que tiene que dictar Argentina para que este convenio forme parte del derecho positivo con el nivel de detalle que requiere su aplicación. Es decir, convertir en leyes locales, sancionar las leyes locales que permitan que este convenio sea operativo dentro de la Argentina. Ya es obligatorio porque ha sido ratificado por el Congreso, pero requiere mayor precisión en cuanto a su aplicación concreta. Ahora, hay otro punto no menos importante, que es la difusión, pero la difusión no simplemente como dar a conocer, sino en cómo incorporar estas normas a las conductas, a las prácticas diarias. Yo siempre digo, no hay derechos si no hay conductas que lo apliquen. La norma por sí sola no es suficiente, sino que requerimos que esas normas sean incorporadas a las conductas de todos los días. Si no, no va a funcionar. ¿Qué estamos haciendo con eso? La verdad que la inserción política y social del convenio para nosotros es muy importante. Con áreas específicas del gobierno, de este ministerio, estamos trabajando con toda nuestra red territorial. O sea, el ministerio tiene agencias territoriales, trabaja junto con los ministerios de trabajo de las provincias, y lo que estamos haciendo es, primero, una tarea de difusión. Hemos hecho ya unos 6 o 7 encuentros virtuales con más de 3.500 inscriptos, expositores de alto nivel, en donde difundimos las normas y las razones por las cuales es bueno para el mundo del trabajo tener este tipo de normas que prevengan este tipo de violencia. Y algo que estamos llamando Qualitas 190, que es un programa de desarrollo, capacitación e incidencia en materia de prevención y erradicación de la violencia laboral desde una perspectiva multidisciplinaria. Hemos trabajado es un sistema de capacitación abierto, en donde capacitamos acerca de estos contenidos. Y por otra parte, lo que estamos trabajando junto con otras áreas del gobierno es una suerte de norma de calificación de las empresas voluntarias que adhieran para incorporar dentro de las empresas estas buenas prácticas. Por supuesto, en todas las discusiones en materia de convenciones colectivas, estamos planteando la necesidad de que sean los propios actores sociales los que incorporen normas vinculadas a este tema. En cuanto a la segunda parte, estamos trabajando junto con todos los actores sociales en los diferentes proyectos de ley. Estimamos que durante este año remitiremos al Congreso para su tratamiento las normas que requiera precisamente lo que yo señalaba, que es este tema de las precisiones, digamos, la letra chica que requiere la legislación local para que este convenio sea plenamente operativo.
Thank you, Minister Moroni. That's really crucial to hear what Argentina has been doing and how the laws are important, but the implementation and acting on those laws are also crucial. Now we have a question back for Senator Quijada, and I hope you're there because we lost you momentarily in your last answer. But this question is really, according to IPO guidelines for the elimination of sexism and harassment and violence against women in parliament, there's a global average of 25% of women in most parliaments around the world. We know that many parliaments remain male-dominated, and women MPs are often underrepresented on decision-making bodies. So why is ending violence and harassment at work so important in promoting women's access to decision-making positions? So could you share with us some examples of IPU's initiatives in preventing and ending violence against parliamentarians?
Sorry, okay. I had a problem earlier with my network, so I'm hopeful that this time I'll go through without having to have that issue. So anyway, this is obviously a primary concern to parliaments, and violence against women in the political world is a universal obstacle to women's participation in politics and to their full contribution to political processes. So when women are excluded, undermined, or coerced in the pursuit of the duties given to them by their voters, it then becomes a double abuse of the women representatives' civil and political rights, and of the rights of citizens to get the most from the representatives that they have elected. It is therefore a prejudice to democratic institutions and to democracy itself. So IPU studies have revealed, because we have undertaken a lot of studies in this field, alarming levels of sexism, harassment, and violence occurring against women MPs and female parliamentary staff. So based on these interviews with women MPs from around the world, the study revealed that over 82% of respondents reported having experienced some form of psychological violence during their mandate, 82%. The prevalence of other forms of violence was also troubling, with sexual harassment at 20% and physical violence at 26%. So those are pretty disturbing numbers. Attacks online are alarming as well. 58% of the women parliamentarians surveyed in Europe, for example, had been the target of online sexist attacks on social networks. Electronic communications are used to threaten female members of parliament with death, with rape and beatings. And so this is in Europe. So we are still continuing with these studies across the other different continents. And so if it's this high in Europe, I shudder to think what it would be in my own continent in Africa. So today in the COVID-19 pandemic, this is further exacerbated as a result of increased use of social media and video conferencing platforms. And we all know that this is not acceptable, and it definitely is not just part of the job. Legislatures as institutions have to lead by example and become safe places for women to work, both offline as well as online. So in 2019, the IPU published a set of guidelines for parliaments to adopt specific internal policies on ending sexism and gender-based violence in their institutions. These guidelines took on the crucial advances of Convention number 190 on broadening the concept of harassment and gender-based violence in the world of work, which is not limited in the case of parliaments to the parliamentary premises and covers all categories of people working in parliament. So not just the parliamentarians, but including the staff as well. So parliaments in Canada, Chile, Finland, Mexico, and the UK have adopted such policies for MPs and parliamentary staff. They include training and awareness, raising, complaint and investigation mechanisms, assistance and support services, as well as provisions for disciplinary sanctions against perpetrators. Or in Kenya, my country, we are actually just now working on this, and we hope to also be able to bring it on board. We haven't gotten there. We also have received a bit of resistance sometimes when we try to bring this sort of thing, but we are working on it as parliamentarians, and we hope to join the Canadas, the Chiles, and the others in getting this adopted. Other parliaments are now taking action to end systematic sexism, harassment, and violence against women. So in parliament, as well as in all walks of life, not just parliament. And so we need to support, but as well as monitor these actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kihika. And it's so good to know that there are so many strides being taken, though also very disturbing to hear the statistics of violence and harassment of women in Europe and around the world. So thank you for that. Now we go back to the experience of employers and back to Mr. Suarez Santos. We know that the role that employers' organizations play with governments to consider the ratification and the implementation of C190 is crucial. So Mr. Suarez Santos, what is the role of the IOE members across the world in this respect? And what support is required nationally and globally to advance efforts made by employers' communities?
Well, thank you again, Sharji. I have to say that the IOE, International Organization of Employers, we always recognize ourselves as a powerful but a balanced network of business organizations around the world. And when we say powerful, it's because our business independent organizations have a strong say in advocacy, in policy setting at national level. That's what makes us also having an influence. But of course, we are linked to values, and these values have to do also with the elimination of violence and harassment at the workplace. So our first approach in relation with any new instrument is also based on action and principles. Here in His Excellency, the Minister of Argentina, you can see that before the ratification, there were important actions that have been already undertaken. I mean, he referred to the Oficina de Asesoramiento sobre Violencia Laboral. He referred to the network of employers that was created before the ratification. So our main approach, our main first approach is undertake strong and efficient action to prevent violence and harassment at the local. So the idea, as I said before, is these three areas of building trust at local level, building trust at the workplace. On the other side, also having the communication channels, also the awareness campaign at the workplace and beyond that and in society, but also having concrete guidance for the employees and for the employers on how to act, what are the behaviors that should be respected, and what are the totally unacceptable behaviors. This kind of action should need to be put at the very beginning in order to assess whether you are or not prepared to ratify a convention, which is going to require you that. This is very important. As a first step, assess where you are as a country, assess where you are as a company, and see whether you are fit to the expectations of the convention and the recommendation. The second element is we do not want just ratified conventions that are ineffective and that are not implemented. We have seen that in the ILO very often. So that's why we want this assessment being made from the very beginning with a comprehensive action. The second element is we do not want also a simple cut and paste what you have in the convention and put it in a kind of internal regulation. No, the convention has important options for flexibility so that you adapt it to your national circumstances. And we have important conversations, important negotiations also to have these flexibilities in many areas, there's reference to appropriate legal provisions according to national practices, etc. Use it. I mean, don't just create the uncertainty of coping something which has been properly designed in a flexible manner to adapt it to your own circumstances. There also have a balanced approach, meaning you need to be effective. You need to identify in the ratification of the convention where the responsibility of the employer is, where the responsibility of the employees is also, and where the public institution should be held. You need separate definitions for violence and harassment at national level. You need different treatment for that so that you are effective. But then an important element, and that's my third message, whenever you are ratifying the convention, you need to have national tripartite consultations in order to identify what are the main challenges that you have at national level. This is a requirement of the convention itself. It's also a requirement of other conventions, the Convention of 144. If you want to be effective, bring the big players here. And the big players, I have to say, are the business organizations and the workers' organizations. You will need to find a kind of agreement or at least a proper effective consultations which will lead you to a national implementation of the conventions which have effect. You do not have these endorsements at national level, the impact would also be much more limited. We have witnessed that in the past. So those are the three approaches that we are taking. Assessment on one side of where you are, and also action. Then use the flexibility that the recommendation is giving to you, not do a kind of cut and paste. Then properly involve the national constituents. That's of essence. And then the ILO has a role to play with us as IOE to share experiences. I mean, the experience of Argentina is great. We need to bring that to others so that they know how to learn from that. Okay? Of course, adapting it to its own national circumstances, but learning from what others have passed, that's also of critical value. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Suarez Santos, and some great advice there that you have. It is truly a tripartite conversation, not just cut and paste that to adapt it to different countries. That's really interesting. Now, before I go to my next question from the workers' point of view, I do want to ask again if any of you listening out there, and it's fantastic to hear from so many people around the world in our chat box, please do keep your questions coming. We'd love to hear more questions in the chat box. At the moment, we have a few, but not enough. So let's get more questions coming, why don't we? So the next question is for you, Mary Clark Walker, and the workers' perspective, of course, is crucial. We know in the past year, workers have been really very active in promoting the ratification of C190. So can you tell us more about effective campaigns and actions where workers have been engaged, and what have you learned so far from them?
Thanks again, Sharonjeet. The ITUC and all of their global union federations that basically represent sectors, International Transport Federation, Public Service International, Education International, UNI, BWI, Industrial. I'm shouting out all of them, so I don't want anyone to feel left out. Include IUF and including the International Domestic Workers Federation have been spearheading a global campaign for the ratification and its effective implementation for quite some time. This global campaign has helped spur trade union action in the form of campaigning, lobbying, advocacy, and engagement in social dialogue in countries right across the world. I think in just about every country. In an increasing number of countries, definitely from Indonesia, Philippines, Australia, and India, Panama, Chile, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Ukraine, they're all participating in campaigns that will push for the ratification and implementation, as well as a growing number of civil society organizations and social justice movements, including human rights advocates, women's organization, and feminist movements have also been supporting this global campaign. Trade unions across the world are carrying out a wide range of 190 activities. We're conducting capacity building sessions with the ILO, using those instruments, running public awareness campaigns. We talked about the media campaigns that are going on, carrying out surveys, doing research, labor law reviews, reviews of workplace policy, and collective bargaining agreements in order to bring them into line with the provisions of 190 and recommendation 206. We're also engaging in social dialogue aimed at ratification. As part of our public awareness raising campaigns as well, unions are organizing webinars. We're running social media campaigns, running online petitions, and participating in radio and TV talk shows. There are so many things that we're doing. I want to talk just a little bit about a couple of the things that are happening in some regions. In the Americas, for example, with the ratification of, with the regional C190 campaign, we put it in place right after the adoption of the ILO instrument. Trade unions are vigorously initiating campaigns right across the continent, which has already led to 3 ratifications. And we know that there are a number more that are coming. From Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, Dominican Republic, and Canada. Trade unions right across are pushing these engagement campaigns and social dialogue with their governments. In the Arab region, in Morocco, they're working together with parliamentarians, which is really good because it's important that we get the message out right across, not just within the trade union ranks, but also within civil society, within communities as well. And I think that the work that they're doing in that region, working together with women's organizations, with parliamentarians to get that message out is crucial. I think in Morocco, they have the campaign with the placards, with the messages about the importance of ratifying C190 again, because of the increase in gender-based violence and the increase in violence overall. In Asia, trade unions have a dedicated regional 190 campaign in place, supported by civil society organizations. In Nepal, trade unions are part of a tripartite Convention 190 action group to advance gender equality and social justice by aiming at the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. In the Philippines as well, trade unions are taking part in tripartite webinars and forums in order to advance the ratification of C190, while trade unions have negotiated new clauses in their collective agreements with provisions that have to deal with C190. Also in Pakistan, trade unions have provided legal aid to workers affected by the layoffs, reduced wages, harassment, and domestic violence. So we can see that there is definitely work going on during the pandemic, and the work has definitely increased during the pandemic. So we really want to make sure that on the 25th, on Friday, we can't believe that it's gone by so quickly. When it does come into force, when Convention C190 comes into force, it will be a day of celebration and action right across the world. The International Trade Union Confederation, as well as all of our global union federations and their affiliates, will be calling on governments to commit to ratifying C190 and its effective implementation in line with Recommendation 206. Global unions will also be launching a new train the trainer toolkit on C190 and Recommendation 206. And the toolkit will definitely go far to assist and equip trade unions and their members with the knowledge, skills, and the necessary tools needed to build a world free from violence and harassment, which also can be shared with other organizations.
Thank you, Marie. That was an incredible look around the world, and giving us explanations of what's going on around the world. It's so fascinating. Now, one final question from me, and it's great that since I last asked, I've got lots of questions on the chat box now. So thank you, all of you, for your brilliant questions, and I'm hoping we can get to all of them. But one final question from me, and this is to the ILO Director General, of course, Guy Ryder. Now, we know there is just 9 years left before the realization of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And COVID-19, of course, poses extra challenges to attaining such an ambitious agenda. So in your view, Mr. Ryder, what should we be doing to accelerate progress in preventing violence and harassment in the world of work, and thereby contribute to a safer, healthier, and better working conditions around the world for all and everywhere?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, even before the pandemic, the world was not progressing well enough or quickly enough towards the objectives of the 2030 Agenda. And COVID-19, unfortunately, has meant that slow progress has even been thrown into reverse. So on the face of it, this is pretty bad news. It sounds pretty discouraging. And yet there are some opportunities here as well. It's very difficult to talk of opportunities out of such a tragic crisis. But think of this. As we've all tried to react to this crisis, we've understood, at least from a world of work perspective, that keeping people safe is not only about protecting them from the virus itself. We've had to broaden our focus and look more closely, probably than we usually do, at issues of psychosocial well-being, of isolation, all of those underlying factors which contribute to the quality of working life, positively or negatively. And I think this has been something of a revelation over the last 15 months. And if you apply that broader consciousness, that broader thought about what well-being at work actually is, I think that can help us moving forward in respect of violence and harassment. We can build it in, I think, to a much more complete notion of the things we're aiming at in the world of work. And this, I think, should give us room for some encouragement, because it's relatively easy for us all, I have to be honest, to condemn violence and harassment, to say we're against it, to say it's unacceptable. We all need to do that, and we all do it. And yet it happens, and yet it's there, and yet it's very prevalent in the world of work. I think this new sort of atmospheric that the pandemic has brought might enable us to be a little bit more effective in surfacing these sometimes invisible problems and then acting upon them. And if you take that premise, which I think is reason for some encouragement, then you can place that into the broader context of what we need to honor this notion of building back better, that we're not just going back to where we were, we're going to somewhere better. Now, I think there is opportunity here. I mean, we've learned over the last 15, 16 months that it is possible to do things in a radically different way than what we did before. Think of this, some 16 trillion US dollars has been spent on COVID-19 response in all of its dimensions. Who could have imagined such a thing? We would have thought that was impossible but it's happened. And in the same way, I think the slow progress towards the 2030 agenda can now speed up. And if it builds in, as I think it must, this notion of broader well-being at work and in society, then I think we can take lessons from the experience, painful as they have been, of recent months, and simply accelerate and to do things in a better way than we previously did. I think the lessons of the past are that when things like this happen, we need to draw the lessons and we need to be coherent in reacting to them.
Some great advice there. Thank you, Director General. And as you say, there is opportunity in something as awful as this whole crisis that we've been undergoing for the last year. Now, at this point, I asked you all for questions and you all delivered. You've all been watching and listening very intently and asking some great questions in the chat box. So what I'd like to do at this stage is now go to this chat box and take a look at some of these questions, and and I'll try to direct them to the various speakers. Some of them are, of course, to selected speakers. But let's start with this very interesting question from Com Kelly Ryan. And this is a question that asks, what role does civil society play in encouraging the ratification of C190 beyond trade unions and beyond civil society, and also beyond employers' organizations? So, this is a really interesting question. I'm wondering if it's one for you, Senator Kihika, to respond to, and of course, anybody else amongst the panelists who want to talk about it. Or if anyone else in the panel would like to respond to that question, the role of civil society and what role it plays in ratifying Convention 190. Yes, Mr. Rabbit?
Shall I have a go?
Go ahead.
First?
Thank you.
Well, obviously, we look to our the ILO looks to its normal customers, if I can put it like that, governments, and I see Minister Moroni's on screen there, and our worker and employer constituents. And as I think you've heard already, they are really mobilized to act on this. But that does not in any way, and I think it's great to have the opportunity to say this, that does not in any way mean that this is an exclusive responsibility, and we look to and benefit from the support and the advocacy and sometimes the pressure of civil society, NGOs of many different types. And we find this in many areas of our work, be it in child labor and domestic employees, many areas of our work. So we hope that along with parliamentarians, who, by the way, have the first responsibility around ratification, because once a convention at the ILO has been adopted, it has to go to parliaments for consideration of ratification. We need to build these broad coalitions, and I think that's exactly the spirit in which we need to move forward now. Thank you for that, DG. Anyone else want to respond to that? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question. We do have a lot of questions now. This is a question that's directed to Roberto Santos. You mentioned the need for flexibility in tune with the country's practices, and perhaps there can be some flex in what is accepted as harassment, depending on local practices. But on violence, should there be any tolerance? That's a question from Pradeep Bhargava. Thank you for that question. And it's directed to Roberto Santos, but anyone can respond.
I'm trying to switch on my video, but the host doesn't allow me. So if you don't see me, it's not because of lack of will.
But we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Yes. I think there is no flexibility in toleration to violence nor to harassment. I mean, let's be clear. I mean, none of the situations. What we are referring is flexibility in the definition. Okay. Now I am allowed to use my video. Okay. I think the flexibility comes is the legal flexibility to define it, because what a convention and many other conventions of the ILO, by the way, do is they provide you the kind of a framing, not just the exact legal definition of each of the concept of violence and harassment, and then you have to adapt it to your own regulation traditions, because each regulation has its own traditions, your own culture, your own context, but of course, on the basis, on the premises that we need to eradicate violence and harassment at the workplace. There's no flexibility there. The flexibility is how you do it, how you get there, how you define it. And there are different treatments for harassment and violence. We all agree on that. So that's the kind of flexibility we need, rather than the flexibility in the concept itself.
Thank you for that. And I believe Minister Moroni from Argentina, you were about to speak earlier. Do you want to say a few words now?
Sí, respecto de la participación de la sociedad civil, la verdad que en Argentina hay un movimiento de mujeres muy importante. Coincidió, básicamente tuvo un momento de mayor consolidación con la discusión sobre la interrupción legal del embarazo y generó una presión muy importante. En general ha tenido una presencia muy fuerte y el gobierno lo que ha hecho es reconocer la existencia de este movimiento. De hecho, tenemos un Ministerio de Mujeres, Diversidad y Género, y hay áreas en todo el gobierno donde se han dedicado áreas dentro del gobierno a estos temas. Así que la verdad que creo que la presencia de las organizaciones civiles, de este movimiento femenino, para decirlo, o de diversidad, para decirlo de un modo más amplio, ha sido muy importante. Ha sido un fundamento importantísimo para validar la ratificación de este convenio.
Thank you, Minister Moroni. That's really crucial. And, you mentioned gender diversity there as a very important thing. This is a question from Bernard as well on the chat box he asked earlier, which is all about C190, which seems to place a lot of attention on women. But can men also be affected? Could any one of you elaborate?
I can elaborate. I think the convention is very clear. Everyone can be affected. Sorry, Guy, perhaps you wanted to go first? Yeah. It's okay. I think everyone can be subject to violence, including the employer, by the way, and has been accepted by that in the convention itself. And of course, the focus on women is very, very important because of the, sometimes the vulnerability, okay? Especially when we talk about sexual harassment. That's very important, but both the convention and the recommendation refer to all as potential subject of violence and harassment, and also, of course, the men can be subject to harassment, and that's also the approach that we all have taken. I mean, no one should be unprotected because of a situation as such.
Thank you for that, Mr. Suarez Santos. Did anybody else want to say something along those lines? If not, I will move to our next question. There's also a wonderful question here, a very interesting question from Archana Patkar. And this is a question on how Convention 190 will be applied effectively within the informal economy, the very dynamic gig economy, for instance. We've been talking about how all of this disproportionately employ different groups of people from the formal sector, especially women in all their diversity and young people. So it's hard to see how the convention will be effective in spaces like the gig economy, for instance. A question from Archana. I'm wondering if any of the panelists would like to respond to that.
I don't know how to do it.
Yes, Minister?
Yep. Oh.
Would anybody like to talk about that question in particular about the gig economy, how the Convention 190 impacts the gig economy, because it's the informal sector, isn't it?
Perhaps, if Chandri, if I may.
Mr. Ryder, go ahead. Yeah.
Just, I mean, there's a couple of aspects, I think, to the question that's been put. One is the informal economy in general. Well, how can any ILO convention effectively be properly applied in the informal economy? Let's not forget where 6 out of every 10 workers in the world finds a living. And there's no getting away from the fact that this is a struggle. This is really a challenge to the ILO's standard system. And of course, for many years now, we've been advocating for and helping our member states work towards formalization of the informal economy so that national regulation and protection systems can apply to them. But clearly, we do need to reach out better. And I think it applies not only to governments, but to workers and employers as well, to try to bring people under the umbrella of the types of protections that ILO conventions provide. The gig economy is a slightly different sort of challenge. It's definitely a challenge, and we've seen during the pandemic that the many people working in the gig economy have found themselves in some quite difficult situations, basically because their legal protections, their employment status is sometimes quite ambiguous. So the danger is they sort of fall down the cracks of the protections which states are offering because, well, are they an employee or not an employee? Where do their social protection rights come from? And these are increasingly issues as we face a more diversified labor markets with different forms of work coming into being. These are challenges which our members and the ILO ourselves are going to have to grapple with in the future.
Thank you for that, DG. That was very great response there, of course. And in fact, let's continue on that line of questioning around informal economy workers, because here's a question from Janhavi Dave, who talks about home-based workers who are very much a part of the informal economy working group. And with many of them dealing with COVID-19 and remote working, the number of home-based workers are increasing. They tend to face increased violence in supply chains. Are employers recognizing home-based workers, and what can we do to ensure that home-based workers find voice in ratification process and policies thereafter? So another question for our panelists, and Susan and Maria, I realize we haven't heard from you yet. So if anyone wants to respond to that one.
I think the employer, Roberto may be able to answer that question a little bit better because they know what they're doing with in terms of the sector. Sorry, I was trying to get on to the earlier question to answer one of the earlier questions, but my video was blocked. But I think that this question is more pertains to some of the work that the IOE is doing with respect to the previous question with the work with within the informal sector. I think it's important that we work very closely with governments. As when we were negotiating it, we did say that governments would have most of the responsibility. So it's about enacting laws and policies to ensure that all workers are protected. And when we talk about all workers, it includes the workers in the informal sector as well. So I'll cede my time and to Roberto.
Thank you, Marie.
Thank you. Again, I need to be accepted, but I will start so we optimize our time. We home workers are workers and need to be protected. And also that's clear in terms of action, what companies are doing. And I think I referred to that when you refer to remote work and the consequence that it has also, not just for mental health, which is another issue, but also in terms of potential harassment and violence situations. Remote work is very challenging in terms of how to deal with remote workers. The way we deal on your own premises, isn't it? But there are ways in which you can really be effective. One has to do, first of all, with, again, the awareness that these workers are workers, and these workers also should be also protected from harassment. And this is an awareness that need to be strengthened in all the company, in all your, with your corporate values. The second, and perhaps the key element for this kind of workers is to have, and I said it before, but it's more pertinent here, confidential channels. Confidential channels of communication, which try to avoid and prevent situations of harassment. When you are in the distance, it's more difficult to have this face-to-face, this kind of human contact. But once you create a kind of confidential channel for remote workers, I think that the situation can improve. And of course, it needs to be clear what is expected and what is not expected in terms of behavior. Because sometimes there is no such as awareness of some kind of behavior with remote workers that you should think that you can address them at some times, by instance, in night, and you are not perceiving as employer, as manager, that you are to some extent entering into a very dangerous zone okay? So that's also a kind of good guidance that need to be provided and need to be settled at the company level. Of course, the big companies, many big companies are already dealing with that, but we need to make efforts for small and medium companies also, so that that we go on this path.
Thank you for that. Now we're running a little bit out of time, so I do want to just push on to the next question. There's a really fascinating question here about the experience of HIV, AIDS, and vulnerabilities. So, question from Early Nuriana. Are there any experiences from countries that link the sexual harassment, violence at workplace with the impact on HIV, AIDS vulnerabilities? I think I will use that as our last final question from the chat box. Thank you all again for your great questions. Would any of the panelists want to respond to that? And I believe to Senator Kihika, if you, or Marie, if you want to talk about that. Yeah.
If I may, sorry, I've been trying to get on as well, but I'm unable. It keeps telling me that I'm.
Well, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as long as you can hear me, I don't need the video. Okay. One, let me very briefly, I know we are running out of time. I had wanted to add my voice a bit to the previous question where you had asked me what the role would be of civil society. And I think as parliamentarians especially, we can't do what we are trying to do alone. And we really need civil society on board so that we are able not only to bring attention to what's going on, but to also have them be able to speak out there and to make the communities know what is not acceptable and what is not doable as we continue with the legislative part of our roles. And on this other last question you were asking, as far as the workers who work from home, for example, we must make sure that all workers are included, whether they work in the blue collar field or they work from home or they come to the office or whatever it is, and especially so during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we must be able to make sure that the companies have guidelines and policies where everybody is included and that the employees as well are aware of what steps the companies would take in being able to solve these issues or what channels or mechanisms they need to follow to be able to have the issues addressed. And also as somebody else said before me, confidentiality also being completely important. Also now you're asking about the HIV AIDS issue. I will cede that one to someone else who maybe has come across it, but I would also imagine that, again, maybe some people may not feel as comfortable to come forward due to the stereotypes and all that sort of stuff. So we must work towards not making it so negative so that people are able to come forward, but also have mechanisms to address that in a confidential way so that it is resolved and the problem is not left out there and the people suffering. The workers. All right. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Kihika. Well, I think we are running out of time, so I will end it there in terms of the questions from the chat box. Thank you for everyone for all of your wonderful questions. For the ones that we didn't get a chance to answer, hopefully, you know, one of the team will be able to get back in touch and be able to respond to some of this. But I would like to now close this dialogue for, with a call to action, which could inspire more countries to ratify Convention 190 and make concrete change, which is what we've been talking about. Could each of you, in 30 seconds or less, launch your call for action to building forward a world free from violence and harassment? We will start our 30 seconds with you, Senator Susan Kihika.
Thank you very much. Okay, now as we rebuild from the pandemic and think about reintegrating populations back into the workforce, we must build forward stronger. We must build forward stronger and ensure that the world of work is safe or safer, both offline and online. That human-centered and gender transformative, it must be. And at the IPU, we will work to make C190 known in parliaments around the world and mobilize it for its ratification. We will associate MPs in advocacy efforts around the implementation of the convention. That's important. And in this endeavor, we will continue to call on parliaments to lead by example and embody the highest standards of our workplace in order to prevent harassment and violence in all places of work. We look forward to partnering with you in all in building a world of work free from violence and harassment. Thank you. Was trying to get it all in 30 seconds. Thank you.
30 seconds, crucial. Senator Kika, I'll ask you to leave your video on. And at this point, I'd like to get all of the panelists to put their videos on because we do want to get a screenshot as you are making your calls to action. Next up, we will get to Mr. Suarez Santos, your 30 seconds call to action.
I'll be short. Employers are committed with action for harmonious and productive workplaces which are free from violence and harassment. Eliminating violence and harassment at work should unite all of us, governments, employers, workers, civil society, international organizations. We need to build on awareness, culture against violence and harassment. We need to build on trust and confidence at the workplace. And we need to work on effective guidance and action on how to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Suarez Santos. Leave your video on because next up we'll go to Ms. Clark-Walker.
Thank you. Short and sweet. The time to act is now. Everyone has a right to a world of work free from violence and harassment. Let's all play our part in making C190 and Recommendation 206 a lived reality through wide ratification and robust implementation. Lives are depending on this, and we are all workers of the world are done waiting.
Thank you for that. Next up, we have Minister Maroney.
En el mundo del trabajo no podemos seguir aceptando la tolerancia de la violencia como toda forma de discriminación. Y eso es precisamente eso, una clara afectación en la igualdad, que nos aleja del trabajo digno. Ahora, pero tenemos que recordar que no es la única. La formalización y la mejora en la distribución del ingreso todavía son, para gran parte del mundo, deudas que tenemos pendientes. Así que no puede ser abordada, la lucha contra la desigualdad no puede ser abordada desde un solo ángulo. Tenemos que trabajar en modo completo. Insisto, contra esta forma de desigualdad hay que luchar, pero no olvidemos que la formalización y la distribución del ingreso todavía, en lugar de progresar, creo que venimos retrocediendo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Minister Maroney. And I remind you all again to leave your videos on, speakers. Finally, we go to Director General Guy Ryder, your call to action.
Mine's a very easy one. I call on all of the ILO's member states to ratify Convention 190 so that what I call the Magnificent Six, who have already ratified, will grow in number. So if we have this conversation in a year's time, we'll be able to have a much bigger conversation with employers and workers' organizations, encouraging ratification, backed by civil society, as we have heard, and of course, and I'm looking at the Senator, with parliamentarians doing their bit to make sure that parliaments agree to ratification.
Thank you, Director General. And thank you all to our wonderful speakers and panelists. Once again, if you've all got your videos on, we're going to take a screenshot now of your wonderful contribution on this incredible discussion we've had. So thank you once again to all our panelists and speakers this afternoon, this morning, wherever you happen to be watching. Thank you for joining us. But now I would like to close the event with a powerful video message from Minister Giselle Renampi, the Minister of Labour, Employment, Public Services and Social Laws, on the commitment of her country, Madagascar, to a world of work free from violence and harassment. For many years, we know Madagascar has been working at all levels to promote decent work for all, including the respect of fundamental principles and rights at work and the elimination of violence and harassment. So this video, I'll remind you, it's in French, so please turn on interpretation if you need it. Let's hear Madagascar's call for action.
Monsieur le directeur général de l'Organisation internationale du travail, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres des différents pays ici présents, honorables participants en vos rangs respectifs, la violence et le harcèlement constituent un cancer social très destructeur dans le monde du travail, souvent moins aperçu, voire dissimulé, du fait de la difficulté de la constitution de preuves de son existence ou de sa perpétration. La violence et le harcèlement, surtout ceux à caractère psychologique ou sexuel, sont des phénomènes très courants dans le monde du travail. Les femmes et les enfants en sont généralement victimes. D'une manière générale, force est de constater que les causes profondes de la violence et du harcèlement en milieu du travail sont souvent liées à la situation de dépendance économique vis-à-vis de l'employeur et à la pénurie de l'emploi qui gangrène beaucoup de pays. Une étude accompagnée par le Bureau de l'Organisation internationale du travail à Madagascar est parue dans les publications sur Internet en 2018, illustre bel et bien les causes et les modes opératoires de la violence en milieu de travail. Madagascar s'est déjà engagé à lutter contre toutes sortes de violences perpétrées, surtout aux travailleurs de tout genre. Des mesures ont été ainsi prises par le gouvernement afin de démontrer sa volonté de protéger les citoyens contre ces fléaux. Des conventions fondamentales et d'autres conventions pertinentes de l'Organisation internationale du travail, en l'occurrence la convention numéro 189 sur les travailleuses et travailleurs domestiques, ont été ratifiées. Ces conventions sont surtout d'ordre à donner plus de protection aux droits fondamentaux au travail. Le Code du travail, adopté en 2004, prévoit déjà des dispositions relatives au harcèlement au travail quand il parle du respect de la dignité de la personne humaine dans son chapitre 3. Le pays a adopté en 2019 la loi numéro 2019-008 relative à la lutte contre les violences basées sur le genre. Actuellement, Madagascar se prépare pour la ratification de la convention numéro 190 ainsi que la recommandation numéro 206 qui l'accompagne. Cette convention est pertinente dans la mesure où, tout d'abord, elle prévoit un champ d'application plus large en incluant toute personne se trouvant dans le monde du travail et qui peut être à la fois auteur ou victime de violences ou de harcèlement. Elle prévoit également des définitions précises de la notion de violence, de harcèlement sexuel et moral perpétrés dans le monde du travail, tout en incluant ceux basés sur le genre. Ce qui est très important, car notre code du travail actuel est un peu imprécis, notamment sur la notion de harcèlement moral, alors que plusieurs travailleurs en sont victimes. Par conséquent, nombreux restent dans le silence par pure ignorance. Ensuite, elle offre une garantie de protection des victimes et témoins, non seulement contre toute forme de représailles, mais également leur assurant d'être retirés de la situation dangereuse. De telles garanties encouragent les travailleurs à dénoncer les violences et harcèlements dont ils sont victimes ou témoins. Enfin, elle prévoit des mesures de soutien et d'assistance socio-psychologique et juridique aux victimes. Ces mesures permettent ainsi aux victimes de recevoir des conseils, d'être prises en charge en cas de besoin, d'être assistées dans l'orientation de leur démarche et d'aboutir à un procès leur assurant d'obtenir des réparations équitables. Ce qui va dans le sens de donner plus d'opportunités aux travailleurs qui, dans la majorité des cas, n'osent pas dénoncer la violence et le harcèlement dans le monde du travail en raison de la difficulté de constitution des preuves et de la peur des représailles comme la rupture du contrat de travail. Je tiens à souligner que Madagascar est actuellement dans la phase de mettre en alignement sa législation avec les conventions de l'Organisation internationale du travail que nous avons ratifiées à travers la refonte du Code du travail. Cette initiative nous permettra aussi de nous assurer de l'atteinte des ODD sur le travail décent et la croissance inclusive, ainsi que la déclaration du centenaire de l'OIT sur l'avenir du travail centré sur l'humain. Par ailleurs, notre président de la République est fort de son engagement quant à la promotion du travail décent pour tous. Bien que la ratification des conventions 190 ne soit pas encore actée, le processus de refonte du Code de travail actuel prend en compte les dispositions de cette convention. Monsieur le directeur général, Mesdames et messieurs, on ne peut pas dissocier l'emploi du respect des droits humains. Alors, œuvrons ensemble pour que le mal soit banni de notre société. Ratifions la Convention numéro 190 et faisons en sorte qu'elle soit effectivement appliquée dans nos droits positifs. Ainsi, nous sommes beaucoup plus réalistes quant à notre ambition de construire un monde du travail exempt de violence et de harcèlement. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous remercie.
Very important message there from Minister Ranampi from Madagascar. And thank you again to all our speakers, and I want to thank them personally and name them. Of course, we have Mr. Guy Ryder, the Director General of the ILO. We have Mr. Claudio Moroni, the Minister of Labour from Argentina, Ms. Marie Clark Walker from the Canadian Labour Congress, Mr. Roberto Suarez Santos from the IOE. We also had Commissioner Helena Dalli join us earlier. We thank her for her commitment and contribution. She had to leave early for another engagement. We also have Ms. Susan Kihika, the Senator in the Kenyan Parliament. So thank you all for your amazing, engaging and lively discussion. And remember, you can learn more about this crucial Convention 190 that we've been talking about. You can access all the ILO campaign resources, which will be available at the website. That's www.ilo.org/C190. This will be available from Friday the 25th. You can download them, discover the new ILO legal guide, and spread the word about Convention 190. This is really, really important. Use the hashtag #RatifyC190 and let's take action to free the world of work from violence and harassment. Thank you all for joining in this really important movement today. I'm Sharanjit Lail, and it's been truly a pleasure to moderate this discussion. Have a wonderful week ahead.